If I had to walk into a paid client shoot with just one lens, this is the lens I would choose every single time. Let me tell you why. I'm Eric, I shoot videos for a living and I share what works for me. So this is the 24-70 consistent f2.8 Art Series Sigma lens. I've used this lens on real client work, events, brand videos, social media content, and fast-paced shoots. Let's talk about why I like this lens so much. First and foremost, the focal length of this lens will cover you for the most part. So anything that comes your way, you can face it, shoot, and you can get great content. Anything from wide shots to medium shots to close-ups, this lens got you covered. It's one lens and it does it all. This lens is perfect for fast-paced scenarios and run-and-gun situations. I use this lens a lot on my documentary films because I often find myself in situations where I need to get a wide shot followed up by a B-roll of a close-up shot and so on. So this lens works really well for me and it stays on my camera, I would say 70-80% of the time on my documentary films. So let's talk about the consistent f2.8 aperture. The consistent f2.8 keeps your exposure and your look consistent throughout the zoom range. But keep in mind that it's not a fast prime. So if your camera is limited in terms of low light capabilities, like an FX30 with the highest native ISO of 2500, this lens might be difficult to adjust for darker situations. If low light is not that big of an issue for you, or maybe you don't put yourself often in scenarios where you're in very low light situations, this lens performs extremely well. It gives you clean and reliable image every time that the client is going to be happy with. But if you are using a full frame camera, even at f2.8, it's still gonna give you great depth to your shots. So now let's talk about the image quality of this lens. The image quality is great across all the zoom range. It's a very sharp lens with natural colors. And in my opinion, Sigma lenses always produce very nice colors, specifically the Art Series lenses. I'm always very happy to send the footage over to my clients when shooting with this lens because I know the quality of the video that they're going to be getting is amazing. Even though it's a third-party lens, the autofocus is incredible. I'm not sure how the autofocus is for photos because I use this lens primarily for videos, but for videos the autofocus is solid. It's on par with Sony lenses in my opinion. I never had any issues with autofocus with these lenses. Face and eye tracking with this lens works really well. Even though it's a third-party lens, on my Sony cameras, every time it nails the focus, every time it's consistent with what it does, and I'm really happy. It does take off the pressure from my shoulders when I'm on shoots. I just know that the autofocus is going to be consistent and really sharp. So the build quality of this lens, it's built like a workhorse. I've took this lens to extreme environments, sand, rain, you call it snow, and it just handled it like a tank. I dropped it multiple times. So yeah, the build quality of this lens is incredible. Even though it's been through a lot with me, it still feels just as good as it was when I just got it straight off the box. The zoom ring, the manual focus ring, the aperture ring, just everything works fine. To this day, the autofocus works fine. I dropped it from big heights. Yeah, it just works really well. It's a very tanky lens that can take a beating. So yeah, it's definitely a workhorse. There are a few more things that make this lens stand out for me. Let's start with the aperture ring. So this lens has a great aperture ring, and let me explain how I use it for my workflow. If I need to adjust my aperture while I'm already recording, if I don't want to make the light in the shot too jerky, what I do, I set the smooth setting on this lens on the aperture ring, and when you adjust it, it's adjusting the aperture very smoothly. So that gives you very consistent, smooth light adjustments. However, there is a caveat to it. When you do move this lens around and if it's set on the smooth setting, it's quite easy to just, grab it in a weird way or touch it with your finger and it will move the aperture. And if you don't double check it when you start recording, you might start with the wrong aperture. So you always have to keep that in mind. Or you can lock it at the automatic and then just use the camera dials to dial your aperture. However, if you don't want to use the smooth option of the aperture ring or locking your aperture at a certain f-stop or the automatic, and you still want to use the aperture ring, there is a clicky version. And what that does, that gives you more feedback when you change your aperture. So whatever suits you, whatever suits your workflow, this lens has you covered. Now let's talk about the buttons. So it has two buttons that you can customize, one on the side and one at the top. Personally, I only use the side button and I use it for focus mapping. So when I'm holding the lens, if I'm zooming in and out, to me it's just sitting very naturally with my thumb to press and toggle the focus mapping to nail my focus every single time. I don't use the customizable button on the top, but maybe you can find a use for it. For my workflow, just one of the buttons for focus mapping works really well if I need to nail the focus very quick without doing too much in-camera settings and adjustments. And the last two things I wanted to talk about is the locking mechanism for the zoom and the locking mechanism for the aperture ring. As I mentioned before, the locking mechanism for the aperture ring, it's very personal of how you want to use it. However, the overlocking mechanism is for the zoom. And the reason you want to do that is when you're traveling and your backpack gets thrown around, if this lens is locked, you are going to be sure that your zoom ring doesn't jerk around and break while your backpack is getting thrown around. Either you're on a plane, in a car. It just gives you that slight peace of mind that your lens is intact, secure, and safe in your backpack. And the last thing that really surprised me with this lens, it does have a weather seal. And I've used it in a very heavy rain, in snow, in winds, in storms, and this lens just held up really well. There was no rain passing through to the sensor or to the lens. You know, everything worked fine in extremely wet conditions. It just held up really well. That's another win for this lens. So now let's talk about the downsides of the lens. In my opinion, they're not so much downsides, they're probably more limits than the downsides, but we have to talk about them either way. So let's start from the size of the lens. It's not your smallest lens on the market. It's definitely on the bigger side of the lenses. It's also quite heavy and bulky. However, for me personally, it's never been an issue. It's not too big. It fits in my backpack perfectly. In terms of weight, I have the big gimbal, the RS4 Pro, and my gimbal handles it perfectly. Handheld shoots, it's not too heavy for me. I use it, hours on end, and it doesn't really strain my back or anything like that. However, I do know people that struggle setting this lens, for example, on a small gimbal like an, Mini 3 or 4, and that's something to be mindful of. However, if you are shooting handheld content, then you're going to be totally fine. If you do have small gimbals and you want to use this lens, you have to be mindful. It is quite heavy, especially when zoomed out. You might struggle to adjust your gimbal. But for what this lens can do, with the versatility of this lens, in my opinion, the size and the weight is very reasonable. Especially at consistent f2.8, I think this lens is just great even with the weight and the size that it has. And maybe at f2.8 it's not the, fastest lens out there. However, I think it's still great. But if you are looking for those, cinematic quote-unquote shots with very blurred out backgrounds, you might want to consider getting primes. In short, if you do love extremely shallow depth of field, this lens won't replace your primes. This lens prioritizes practicality over cinematic extremes. And the last thing is the price. My personal opinion, the price is very justifiable for what the lens can deliver and for what the lens can do. When I've bought this lens, I've bought it for £1,250. I think now it is still the same, roughly like 1,100 or something along the lines. So it is on the pricier side of the lenses. However, it's still cheaper than the Sony 24-70 G Master Mark II or whatever. This is the Mark II of Sigmas as well. So they do have the Mark I, which is probably a bit cheaper. I've never used the Mark I. This is the Mark II. And so I've bought it for £1,250. And in my opinion, with everything you get from it, it's a bargain. Because you still get very sharp image, you get the weather seal, you get the aperture ring, you get everything you would get from top-end lenses out there for, I would say, half the price. So in my opinion, the price is very justifiable. However, I know that everybody has different budgets and different financial situations, so the price could be a factor in getting this lens. However, if you do want to get this lens, I will leave some links down below. Now let's see who is this lens for. If you shoot client work, branded videos, or anything fast-paced, this lens definitely makes sense for you. If you work in slow and controlled environment with, cinematic look in your mind, maybe you should consider primes. So to wrap this video up, I want to say that this lens is very reliable, it's professional, and it's a versatile lens. And this is what clients pay for. So this is the reason, if I had to go on a paid shoot with just one lens, I am choosing this lens right here. If you want real-world videography advice from someone who's actually doing the work, consider subscribing. But for now, you guys keep creating, and I'll see you in the next one.